We're going to get started this Tuesday morning with the cabinet for the second Trump term in the White House continuing to come into focus. It looks like more members of Congress are set to join the administration. President-elect Trump is expected to nominate Florida Senator Marco Rubio in the coming days to become Secretary of State. That is according to three sources familiar with that selection process. Rubio was once a Trump rival, of course, for that Republican presidential nomination, but then later became a close ally. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump has selected another Florida lawmaker, Congressman Mike Waltz, to be his national security advisor. That's according to sources familiar with the matter as well. It's also been reported that the president-elect has nominated South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem to be his Secretary of Homeland Security. NBC News has not independently confirmed that selection. Immigration, of course, expected to be a big focal point in a second Trump term. Well, this all comes as Mr. Trump is set to meet with President Biden tomorrow in the White House. We've got team coverage ahead this hour, including the latest on the balance of power in Congress, something we are still closely watching, plus more on a decision expected today by a judge here in New York on whether President-elect Trump's 34 felony count hush money conviction will be overturned. A lot to get to this morning. We're going to start with NBC News correspondent Dasha Burns. She has, of course, covered the Trump campaign extensively throughout this election. I am happy. My heart is warm to see that it looks like she is at home. Finally, that's good news. Dasha, thanks for joining us. Let's get started with President-elect Trump leaning towards these two Florida lawmakers. I mentioned them, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, for key roles in his administration. What should we know about these possible picks?
Well, it's interesting to see how many folks are getting selected from Florida and New York, the two poles of power in Trump world at this point. But look, Marco Rubio was an interesting pick, given that he isn't seen as staunchly MAGA as some of the others, though he has been staunchly loyal to President-elect Trump. His view on international relations, on foreign policy, is a little bit more traditional in the Republican sort of hawkish approach. He's not as isolationist as President-elect Trump, but a lot of Republicans see this as a good choice, kind of balancing those two interests in the Republican Party. There's the folks that want fully America first, and then there are some that do want to see America still hold a lot of influence over global affairs. So this is somebody who is respected by his fellow Republicans in this position. He was on the Foreign Relations Committee. Representative Mike Waltz, of course, is a veteran Green Beret. He is another staunch Trump ally. And again, the buzzword for all of these picks, Savannah, is loyalty.
There you go, Dasha. No, keep us posted as we get more and more of these announcements. Also, as we mentioned, President-elect Trump is going to be in Washington tomorrow. He will meet with President Biden. He's also set to meet with GOP congressional leadership. That's according to two sources familiar. Tell us what we know about these meetings.
Yes, so the meetings with the current president and the president-elect, that has been a courtesy and a tradition for decades now, notably one that was not extended to President-elect Biden by then President Trump. He did not concede the 2020 election. However, Obama did invite Trump to the White House back in 2016. They had a 90-minute meeting. Sometimes the VP, Vice President-elect, and the current Vice President also have meetings. So at this point, we're not hearing that J.D. Vance will participate. We also know that President-elect Trump will be meeting with House Leader Mike Johnson, and also with whoever the Senate Majority Leader will be, which we will find out at some point tomorrow. Savannah.
We sure will. Still waiting on that one, too. Dasha, we're also hearing that FBI Director Christopher Wray is preparing for the possibility he may be replaced. So that's according to three people familiar with the matter. But Wray was appointed to a 10-year term, people might remember, by Mr. Trump himself. This was back in 2017. That would mean he's still got some years left. What more can you tell us about this potential decision?
Well, since that appointment, Savannah, there's been a lot of bad blood between President-elect Trump and these intelligence agencies, particularly the FBI. One of the things that he promised is to clean house at the FBI and the DOJ, and this will likely mean that Christopher Wray is out of a job. He's going to likely pretty dramatically change the staffing at the FBI and the DOJ. That's among his top priorities, Savannah.
Dasha Burns, as always, we appreciate your reporting. Thank you so much. Well, meanwhile, a decision is expected today by the presiding judge here in New York over whether to overturn the jury's guilty verdict in President-elect Trump's hush money case. So Trump was found guilty of 34 felony counts. This was of falsifying business records to conceal payments to porn actress Stormy Daniels. Well, Judge Juan Merchan will also decide if Mr. Trump's sentencing should continue as scheduled. It was set for just a couple weeks from now, November 26th. If sentencing goes forward, he could face probation, hefty fines, or up to 4 years in prison. Well, Trump's legal team called the verdict into question. This is after the Supreme Court decision just happened back in July. It gives presidents some level of immunity for official acts. To help break this all down, we are joined by NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, good morning. So lots of what-ifs we're going to go through here. I'll get to that whole piece of the immunity aspect of it and how that could impact in just a moment. But first, let's just start with, what's the likelihood that Judge Merchan just does side with President-elect Trump and this is overturned?
Okay, so we're talking first, we have today possibly that the judge may actually dismiss the case. There was a lot of focus on sentencing, but this case may never make it to sentencing because first, the judge is going to decide whether or not the immunity decision by the Supreme Court means that there is no case at all, and the guilty verdict, including that guilty verdict, would also be gone if he dismisses it. If he does not, and it proceeds to sentencing, then I think a very low likelihood that he's incarcerated. But let's just talk briefly about the immunity decision. Here is what Justice Merchan is not deciding today. What he is not deciding is whether or not paying off an adult film star is an official presidential act. In fact, Trump's team isn't really even arguing that. They're arguing something a little more nuanced, which is that based on the Supreme Court's immunity decision, there's also certain evidence you can't bring in a criminal prosecution. And some of that evidence, even though Michael Cohen paid off Stormy Daniels before Trump was president, after he got in office, he reimbursed Michael Cohen from the White House. And the DA's office called as witnesses some of the people, Madeleine Westerhout, people that worked for Trump and introduced evidence that was generated during his time in the White House. And what the defense is arguing is that you can't even use that evidence against a former president. Now, some of that evidence is something like tweets from his real Donald Trump account, which went to everybody and was no secret to anyone. So there is a close call here, and the close call is whether or not that conduct, whether or not all conduct after someone is in the White House is presumptively official conduct that cannot be used as evidence. And the immunity decision didn't really give us a clear guideline on how that works.
So just walk us through what does happen if the case is dismissed. What does that look like?
It goes away. Now, that is appealable by the DA's office, but the case goes away. There is no sentencing. His conviction is vacated. It's as if he was never convicted. Is
there a world where he could be retried?
Well, here's the way that would work. It depends on what the judge decides. If he throws out all of that evidence in theory and vacates the conviction, when a conviction is vacated, double jeopardy does not apply. Not always. I mean, there are exceptions, but double jeopardy doesn't always apply. So in theory, he could be retried, but they would have to remove that evidence. That is one possibility, but either way, if it is vacated, you can expect that the DA's office will appeal to the extent they can. And since it involves the immunity decision, it's possible that this appeal could end up back at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. I love how you always play ball with giving us predictions. What do you think is more likely here, that he does dismiss it or that he does not?
That is a really tough one. I think some of the procedural things the judge has done indicates that he's seriously considering it. The fact that he pushed off all of these decisions until after the election and that he's issuing a written opinion. Just generally speaking, if a judge is going to issue a written opinion, it means he's really thought about it. When you could see a world where the judge looked at this and said, OK, you called Madeleine Westerhout, you called Hope Hicks. Those are White House employees. But let's go back to the core. This is about a personal payment to a personal attorney for a repayment to a porn star. No official conduct. And that's really what the DA's office is arguing. This really could go either way. But if the case goes to sentencing, I will make a prediction. He doesn't go to prison.
So, OK, so let's talk through that. So the purpose of sentencing is to hear, OK, well, you know, what's ultimately the punishment here? If this is not dismissed, does that, first of all, does that continue just a few weeks from now while he's also, by the way, in the middle of, selecting his cabinet on November 26th as previously planned? And what does that mean? What does sentencing look like if it's not dismissed, we move forward with that, but he doesn't go to prison?
Great question. I would expect that the defense at least might seek what's called an adjournment adjournment, pushing off this sentencing and pushing it off for 4 years, magically, until Trump is out of office. But if it goes forward, I believe he will not get a sentence of incarceration. And here's why. This is barely a felony. It is a Class E felony, and it was only elevated that way because of an aggravating theory posed by the government. Second, you have all the factors. Again, I look at this as sentencing as a criminal defense attorney and think about all the cases that come before a New York City Supreme Court justice: murder, arson, rape, robbery, all these other things. You've got nonviolent, no guns, no drugs, first-time offender. The offender is over 70 years old. You have almost every argument for a non-incarceration sentence. The strongest argument for incarceration is that Trump annoyed the heck out of the judge throughout the trial, which is a non-zero factor that the judge will probably consider. But every other factor is in favor of a probation-only type sentence.
Danny Savalos, we appreciate it. A lot to talk about as we get more information today. Thank you. Well, this morning, while we are still waiting to see which party controls the House of Representatives, we are getting a clearer picture of the final makeup of the Senate. This is after NBC News projected that Democratic candidate Ruben Gallego is the winner of Arizona's Senate race. Gallego will be the border state's first Latino senator. We have NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale joining us on this now. Ali, good morning. So another call here. Arizona, though, it's a mixed bag, right, when it comes to politics, and certainly for Democrats. The state went for President-elect Trump, but then they take this Senate seat. Talk to us about this result and what Gallego is expected to be able to accomplish for Arizona in the Senate.
We're actually seeing this fascinating story start to emerge about senators, including Democrats like Gallego, but also just to the west of him in Nevada, the fact that Jackie Rosen is likely to be able to keep her seat. All of these are kind of the telltale signs, if you will, that even though Trump had a wave in his favor, there were voters who were willing to entertain the idea of ticket splitting. And so that's certainly what we saw in places like Arizona. If I still had that magic wall, magic big board still behind me, I would be able to show you the way in which he did it, because I imagine it went through places like Maricopa County in the Phoenix area where Gallego was able to run up the score even as Trump managed to win there. But that was really because Gallego tried to go in a nonpartisan fashion and try to pick up not just Democrats who want to hear his message as a Democrat, but also Republicans who might be reluctant to vote for Kari Lake, in large part those McCain Republicans that still exist in Arizona. Lake was struggling to pick those up. Gallego was eager to do that, though, and that's likely the story of how he was able to win this seat and come to Washington.
Ali, you killed it with the board, by the way. It was so fun to see you doing that. Let's talk about another Senate race, because we know
I can just imagine it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, here's Maricopa. We know the Republicans have won the Senate. We've been talking about that a lot, but there is still a race that NBC News hasn't called. It is an all-important Pennsylvania. We do have the Republican candidate, though, Dave McCormick, declaring victory. But what's going on here? How close is this?
We are watching the Bob Casey campaign. Casey, of course, the incumbent senator there, say, let's wait, let's count all the votes, let's be patient. Republicans, though, including McCormick, are saying this thing is done and they want McCormick to come to Washington. That's not because they want him to start his term early. None of this really kicks into play until January, but new member orientation starts this week. McCormick, if he wins, would be one of those new members. And also Republicans tomorrow, you touched on this with Dasha, have their Republican leadership election. That's going to be crucial. It also could be tight. McCormick would have a vote in that. Now, all of this comes down to whether or not the current majority leader, which is Democrat Chuck Schumer, allows McCormick to come. But Republican senators are also working their own way of getting him there to Washington and into the Capitol. Several of them say, hey, we're going to escort him in. He's going to be our guest. And that's the way that McCormick is going to be able to come to Republican freshman senator orientation without technically being the senator from Pennsylvania, because that race we have not called, others have not called it. Though I will say, when you look at where the vote totals are still outstanding, there is a very narrow and getting narrower path for the incumbent Democratic senator there, Bob Casey.
Every time you say new member orientation, or I hear that, it's just suddenly all the new members of the Senate are like college kids wearing backpacks. It's so funny. Ali, before I let you go, we do have to talk about where things stand in the battle over control of the House. Is there a realistic path here for Democrats to victory right now?
I like that you said college because I definitely think about them as like elementary age getting on the school bus with their lunches. But whatever, we're going to get out of this fantasy land that we're living in. On the House side, there are actually some new members who might not know if they're coming to Congress yet. We knew that races in Alaska and California were going to take a while to count. That is certainly a reality that is still in play, and we're waiting to see what this majority actually shakes out being. For their part, Democrats that I speak to, although they did see a potential path, losing seats over the weekend in places like Colorado and Arizona makes that path basically non-existent at this point. Democrats know they are likely to be in the minority here. Republicans preparing as if they have the majority. But this is where former president, now President-elect Trump might be making their lives a little more difficult. We talk about how close the margins are. That margin's still being counted in real time. But the more members that he takes out of the House of Representatives, the harder it gets. So far, we know that he's taken 2. But in the instance of someone like Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, going into the administration as well, that means there's a vacant seat back in South Dakota. Are there other members of the House that might want to run for that who have higher ambitions while staying close to home? There are trigger effects and domino effects to all of these decisions. Even if he's not directly taking someone out of the House, it could have an impact. And the thing you got to remember here in the House of Representatives is people can get sick, deaths can happen at random or spontaneously, and that can change the balance of power. One person being absent because they had outpatient surgery one day could be a difference maker for key votes. Things happen all the time, and that's the reality of close margins in Congress.
So important, such great context. Ali Vitale, grab your backpack, head to the Hill. We'll see you a little bit later. Thank you so much. Let's turn now to the growing devastation from deadly wildfires that are burning on both coasts. In Southern California, the mountain fire has destroyed close to 200 homes. Higher humidity, though, and lighter wind conditions have helped firefighters get the 20,000-acre wildfire to about 40% containment. But, of course, those conditions could change. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, crews along the New York and New Jersey border are still trying to tame what's called the Jennings Creek fire. More than half of the country is currently experiencing a moderate drought. For a look at how these gusty and dry conditions can continue to impact the Northeast and what's going on across the country, let's get a check on your Morning News Now weather with Angie Lastman here in studio. Hey, Angie, good morning.
Hi, Savannah. Good morning to you. You're exactly right with everything you just said about the dry conditions, the low humidity, the really ingredients that we need to see those fires continue burning and potentially more fires start here through the day today on both coasts. Let's start with the Northeast, though, where we've got 35 million people under these fire alerts. Where you see the orange, that is an elevated wildfire risk. But where you see that brighter pink stretching from Boston down to New York, that is that red flag warning. It's been in effect for days. And it's basically all of the things that I said. When you have those ingredients of the really gusty winds, the low humidity, and of course, those very dry conditions that we've seen ongoing across this region, it's not hard for some of these fires to start and spread. Here's the big picture look at what we're expecting as far as those winds. This has been problematic. You might have noticed it over the past couple of days. And those winds are going to be quite strong out of the northwest today. 33-mile-per-hour wind gusts peaking in Hartford, rather, a little higher than that in Boston. But we could see some peak wind gusts across this region up to 40 miles per hour. That, of course, makes things all the more difficult when it comes to fighting those fires. Meanwhile, we know that we've got a drought. We've got that expanding across parts of the country. But look at just how our fall rainfall totals are sizing up in comparison to what we normally get. So 5 to 25% of average rainfall totals are what we've seen for the Northeast. That means that we are dealing with potentially in some spots the driest fall on record so far to date. But we could see this last year for a little while longer. We really don't have any substantial rain in sight for this region. And we've got places like New York, Philadelphia, Hartford, Scranton, Atlantic City, all seeing that driest fall on record so far. And it likely will continue. Here's what we're running as far as those total amounts since the beginning of September. Just over an inch and a half in New York City. We normally have more than 8 inches by this time. Similar story for Hartford, not even over an inch of rain in Philadelphia. So we are desperate for some rainfall. And that, of course, is only expanding that drought that we've been talking about so much. 60% of the Midwest and the Northeast now under drought conditions. And you can see where there is extreme and exceptional drought across that region as well. Switching gears to the West Coast, a very different story. We've got the Pacific Northwest dealing with heavy rain, heavy snow potentially, and some strong winds. So we've got this next atmospheric river event that's going to kind of leave us with an active week ahead for this region. The Cascades and the Northern Sierra, you're going to pick up some really impressive snowfall amounts here over the next couple of days. Coastal Valley, that's where that rain is going to see, upwards of 3 to 5 inches in some spots. But notice that we could see some locations receiving up to 8 inches of rain. So we'll watch for the flooding potential there for those conditions as it develops over the next 2 days, basically. But that's where all the rain is, and that's where all the snow is. So that's what we're going to be watching here, big picture wise. The snowfall totals, not quite as impressive, but I mean, a foot in some of these spots, Savannah. We're going to see those across parts of the Rockies, which, by the way, is getting a little bit of snow today, but nothing quite as impressive as what they're going to see, again, across the Cascades and the Northern Sierra. This will be something that we start to see wrap up here as we get into the middle of the work week. But looking ahead to your weekend, we've got the really dry conditions across the second half or across the eastern half of the country. That's where we'll see mild conditions. No surprise, those warm highs are going to last across the southern tier. We've got temperatures in the 80s and the 70s along the Gulf Coast. It'll stay windy, unfortunately, as we get into Saturday for folks across the Northeast. If you're looking for some fall-like conditions, I'd say in the Midwest, mid-50s, plenty of sunshine for you on Saturday. And unfortunately, not a whole lot of rain in sight for the eastern half of the country, but we will start to contend with another system that works in the Pacific Northwest by the time we wrap up the weekend. So that is where all the rain and snow is, Savannah, but we sure do need it across the Northeast.
Yes, we do. All right, Andrew Lossman, thank you so much. We'll see you next hour. Well, one small, tight-knit town in Indiana is finally getting justice for the 2017 double murder of 2 teenage girls. After years of questions in the unsolved murders that baffled investigators and set the town on edge, a jury found 52-year-old Richard Allen guilty on all counts following the 4-week trial. NBC News correspondent Maggie Vespa has the details.
After more than 7 years, a stunning verdict in the Delphi double murder trial, with a jury finding Richard Allen guilty in the 2017 slayings of 13-year-old Abby Williams and her 14-year-old best friend, Libby German. Indiana prosecutors in closing arguments saying Allen slit their throats. He stole the youth and life away from Abby and Libby. Telling jurors the local husband, father, and pharmacy tech is the so-called bridge guy seen in video taken on Libby's cell phone the day the girls went missing and heard in this audio recording as prosecutors said he forced them off a walking trail at gunpoint. The prosecution arguing Allen left their bodies by a creek, Libby naked, saying he left a cartridge from his gun at the scene, owned a black Ford Focus captured on surveillance video nearby, and made multiple confessions behind bars, playing a recorded call of Allen telling his wife, "I did it," adding, "I killed Abby and Libby." His wife pushing back, saying, "No, you didn't." Amid a back and forth, Allen softening, saying, "Maybe I did. I think I did." His wife later crying, saying, "No, you didn't. They're screwing with you to get you to say things." The defense calling those false confessions, saying Allen was suffering from psychosis after being held in solitary confinement for 13 months. They argued there's no DNA evidence tying Allen to the scene, said tests comparing that bullet to his gun were inconclusive, and blasted the state's desperation after the murders went unsolved for 5 years. The jury not buying it and convicting a killer in a case that's consumed this tight-knit town.
Do you think this case will stick with this town, is sticking with this town?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. If not just because of the court case, also it's just because the 2 little girls that died here, and that's just awful.
Yeah.
That will always be in our hearts.
Yeah.
It's a permanent scar.
Yeah.
Family members and attorneys in this case have been barred for now for speaking about this verdict under a gag order that the judge is leaving in place until Richard Allen's sentencing. That's set for December 20th, and he faces up to 130 years in prison. Back to you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.